Glad to see that everyone has found your seats. My name is Veronica Hannes, and I'm the coordinator for this event. Thank you for attending GWAMET's 2012 Leadership Conference. Before we get to our main event, I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce GWAMET. GWAMET, or the Graduate Women at MIT, is a student group whose mission is to promote the personal and professional development of women at MIT. The Leadership Conference in the fall is one of these programs. Others include the Spring Empowerment Conference, Mentoring Program, collaborative events, advocacy events, and more. I'd like you to take a moment to join me in welcoming our panel. From the far right, we have Nancy Levy of Biotech Management, Afrin Bellariso of the Technology Licensing Office, Andrea Chavella of Cancer Research Technology, Sara Seager of MIT, and finally, our moderator, Dean Ortiz, who is the Dean of the Graduate Education. Welcome.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the panel. I'm happy to be here, and I'll be moderating tonight. So I think we'll just have our panelists just introduce themselves briefly, a little about their background, and then we'll start with some questions, and then in the end, we'll take some questions from the audience. So maybe we can start down at the far right.
Terrific. Can you hear me? Is this okay? Terrific. I'm Nancy Levy. My background, I have a PhD from the University of Chicago. I came out here in the 80s to Harvard Medical School, became an assistant professor, and I went into biotech in the late 80s. I have worked at companies such as Genzyme and Millennium. I built my own company called Immunetics. I helped finance that company. In the last 10 years, I've been on my own, running my own consulting business, which does strategy and business development for companies in the U.S. as well as internationally. So, is that enough?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Afrin Bellariso. I started my professional life here at MIT. I got a PhD in mechanical engineering and went to work in a think tank called Bolt Brannick and Newman, which is now part of Raytheon. I did a lot of government-sponsored research in underwater acoustics and signal processing, and was a very good scientist until I decided to go back to Sloan School, get an MBA, and join the dark forces of marketing. After MBA, after Sloan, I joined Analog Devices as international marketing manager, and I stayed with Analog for about 7 years. I was product line manager, strategic marketing manager, a variety of different positions at Analog, and I left in 1997 to join Intel Corporation. I worked for Intel for about 4 years, and the last 2 years, I became part of even a darker sphere called, I worked for Intel Capital, and I became an investment manager. Looked at a lot of startups, but evaluated them for Intel to invest in. After Intel, I left Intel to join a small company that didn't make it after 9/11, lost its funding, and I'm sure some of you guys who will join startups know the problem. And then after that, I did work for another small company, and eventually I ended up becoming a consulting. I did commercialization of technology, and in that capacity, helped a number of big companies find applications for their technologies and vice versa, technologies to do the applications that they needed to do. In September of this year, I joined MIT Technology Licensing Office, and I am now managing their portfolio in electronics and semiconductor.
My name is Andrea Chavella, and I was an undergrad at MIT. In fact, I spent about 1.5 years in this building working in Bob Weinberg's lab, which is where I became very interested in the cancer field. After undergrad, I went to Harvard to get a PhD, again in the area of cancer. And while I was there, I saw a poster on the wall in the hallway a year before I graduated, advertising a postdoc at Genetics Institute, a biotech company. It wasn't very common to do that then, and I was kind of naive enough to just call them and say, "What's this about?" And I remember they asked for a resume, and I didn't even have a resume. It was very intimidating. But long story short, I ended up doing my postdoc at Genetics Institute for 3 years, which was very interesting. After that, I went to a startup. It was only 10 people at the time. It was founded by David Hausman, who's a faculty here, called Variogenics. And it was in the personalized medicine field, a bit before its time, so trying to predict who will respond to what drugs by doing tests. I was in the lab for 3 years, and then talk about the dark side. They asked me to join business development, and I remember my first thought was, isn't that sleazy? I really didn't know. So I did join business development for 3 years. The company actually went public, reached 135 people. Unfortunately, the business model was a little before its time, and it ended up going out of business, but it was an incredible learning experience. I then also went to the MIT Technology Licensing Office, and I had never worked in patents or licenses before, so that was very new for me, and a very steep learning curve, but very interesting. And I was there for about 4 years, but I was missing being in the cancer field, and I had an offer to go back into doing licensing in the cancer field, and I now work for Cancer Research Technology, which helps to out-license discoveries made from the funding of a large UK cancer charity called Cancer Research UK. So I'm part of most of the office is in London, but they have 3 people here whose job is really to facilitate interactions with pharma and biotech companies to introduce them to our projects and hope that they will license them and run clinical trials and run with them. That's it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sara Seager. I'm a professor in planetary science and in physics. And my time with industry is a little unique. It's that in the world of planetary science, we're seeing the sort of old model at NASA not working that well, and we're seeing a new rise in the commercial spaceflight world. And one of these new startup companies, they're called Planetary Resources, and some of you will have heard of them because they're the ones who made the big announcement about wanting to mine asteroids. They actually wanted some technology that my group had developed. So we're working with them now, actually, and it's always interesting to see the difference between academia and industry, but this connection may be one of the closest that overlaps.
Great, thank you. And I'm a faculty and professor of material science and engineering. I was trained as a material scientist. I work on biological tissues, musculoskeletal and exoskeletal tissues, and bio-inspired materials. And as you heard, I'm also Dean for Graduate Education at MIT for the last 2.5 years. So thank you for joining us today. Happy to have you. And I guess the first question I would start with is, when did you realize what you wanted to do, what you're doing now? So we have a whole array of different career paths. And what steps did you take to reach your goals? How directed or undirected or random walk was your path? So anyone can sort of jump in.
I think when I came to MIT, I wanted to become a scientist. I really had a passion for it. Being young, I didn't mind working long hours, concentrating on one thing, and then when I worked for BBN, it was the same thing. I was a scientist. And at some point in my career, I felt that what I'm doing is not impacting regular people's lives in the way I wanted to. And that's why I wanted to become a marketing person, because I wanted to have interactions with people, and I wanted to do some more commercial work, so to speak. But it was a hard sell. You have an MIT degree and a lot of technical background, and you're trying to convince somebody to pay you to become something totally different. So I think that's why I came back to Sloan, and that's how that changed. To be?
I would say I was just a bit different. I fell into my PhD at the University of Chicago because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I was going to stop and get an MBA because I have a sales and marketing personality, and I knew that I did, but I got sucked into the science, and I really, really enjoyed it. So it was just, it kind of happened, and then I came to Harvard, and it was just kind of happening all around me. And then my first job out of Harvard was at a company called Hygeia Sciences, which was a very interesting company where I was allowed to, I ran a project scientifically, but it was small enough that I was able to work with the sales and marketing people. So I learned how to do SOPs, I did focus groups, so I ended up learning on the job kind of how a lot of the business side of biotech, blah, blah, blah. And I said to my boss there, you know, how do I get out of the lab? And he said something like, leave the science off your resume. Don't put your papers down, or something like that. And it was kind of, that's how I kind of made the switch over. I applied for a job at Genzyme in the sales and marketing group, and I just tailored my resume to show my skills in certain areas and kind of downplayed the fact that I was a great scientist. So, and that's how I got where I am today.
So all I knew out of high school was I loved biology, so I came here to be a biologist, and I didn't really know what happened after that. And I thought I should get a PhD because my parents had degrees, and they kind of instilled in me that was the thing to do. So I got a PhD and really didn't know. I hadn't actually started asking the question yet of what to do. As I said, I saw that poster from Genetics Institute a year before I was ready to graduate. But once I ended up at a biotech company, I knew it was a good fit for me because it was more applied, and that just fit my personality better to be able to envision a path to a patient a little more easily than the basic research, which of course is on which everything is based. And I have to say that the lesson I've learned over life is that serendipity can be a great friend. So I wasn't one to have a 5-year plan or anything like that. I kind of just wanted to enjoy what I was doing and see what came next. And when I was done with my postdoc at GI, I had a friend who'd started a company, and he said, Andrea, if you don't go to a startup, you're missing out on life. Here are 3 VCs, call them and see what they have to say, which I found incredibly intimidating, and I was trembling in my boots, but I called them, and that actually, that led to the job at Variogenics. And so I would just say, it's great if you do have a plan and then work toward it, that's great. But on the other hand, if you don't particularly have a plan, there are probably a lot of different things that could make you happy. And serendipity is a great friend. So throw yourself out there, and accidental collisions will happen from time to time that can change your life for the better, and that's a good thing.
I'll just briefly say my path was a random walk. And I'm looking at the list of questions here. What are the requirements of leadership? And I'll build upon what you were saying, that being able to recognize where that serendipitous case is actually really good for you. And that's really critical. So in my case, when I look back, that's what I was doing. I was doing the random walk, but I picked up a new thing, a new opportunity as it came about.
Great. Thank you. So I guess I will follow up on that on what traits do you feel have helped you to get where you are today, and when did you begin to realize the importance of those traits? It's a great question.
So I've come to a realization only in the past couple of years that there's one trait that you might not hear a lot of people talk about, but I've come to believe it's wildly important, which is actually the trait of empathy. Not sympathy, but empathy, being able to see things from others' point of view. And if you really develop that skill, it changes everything. It changes how you negotiate. It changes how you interview at jobs. It changes the relationship you end up developing with your coworkers, which of course changes your ability to influence without authority if you need to. It's obviously very good for a marriage as well, et cetera, et cetera. So, I really think if you can practice trying to see the world from others' points of view and then behave accordingly, I actually think it has a very strong effect. And as kind of a secondary one, as a related, again, kind of a touchy-feely characteristic, but I have come to believe it's really important, is just kindness. We all have things that other people could beat us up for. And if you're the type of person who kind of is very critical of other people and beats them up for things, it's not good, because people could beat you up for things. But if you're kind to people, understand where they might be coming from, it multiplies 100-fold in what you get back. It's also just the right thing to do. But in terms of a career, I think it can actually be really helpful to build your network and to have good friends who actually care about you, or good colleagues or members of your network who actually do care about helping you.
Well, actually, I need to jump in to disagree.
Go ahead.
I mean, I've seen a lot of cases, especially with women, where they're too nice. So it's one thing to be kind to people, but this often results, especially at this early stage, in a lost opportunity. And I mean, I could start to give some examples if you need them, but I think it's a major, major, major problem. And I see it a lot in female students, even in myself when I was a student, that you're just so busy doing stuff for other people that you never do your own thing, or that there's an opportunity and you step back and let someone else take it. Now, the way I look at the world in science, at least here we can have the privilege of doing this at MIT, I'm like, well, if someone else can do it, they can do it. I'll just do the things other people can't do. But what you don't realize is that sometimes you need to get first and be aggressive and be number one in order to get the job that lets you think that way. And so I constantly see this in women, and there's some more questions later related to family. I didn't realize this stuff until I actually became a mother. I realized that, like, your kid's not going to survive unless you put them first when they're a baby. And I sort of then, in that thing people hate, extrapolation, but I saw that in me and the other people around me doing that.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think, being kind is one thing, but not kind to the point where you're ruining your own chances.
Right, and I agree. I agree completely.
I think it would be more fun if you disagree, but I'll take
I'd be naive if I didn't disagree with that.
I would say what I learned in my second job, which was at Genzyme, was it does not matter at all how smart you are, which was a big come down for me because I'd been at the University of Chicago and I'd been at Harvard, which are kind of two iconic places, let's say, and MIT also, which I wasn't a part of. And it has nothing to do with success in the business world. It's not how smart you are. It really has much more to do with how passionate you are, how persistent you are, how energetic you are, and how you really believe in whatever it is that you're trying to do. So it's very different, I think, in some ways than academics, because I think in academics, in many ways, you have to do those things too, but you also have to be smart for other reasons. And I think also the politics of business are very different. There are huge politics in academics as well, but they are different than the politics in business. So being able to kind of figure out how to, drive along that path, I think is really important as well. So.
I think for me, I'm a born engineer. I always consider myself an engineer, and engineers are problem solvers. I look at every situation as a problem. I think about it, and I try to approach it rationally when there is a lot of irrational elements to a lot of situations that we all deal with. The other thing is that you have to learn how to trade off between different things. You can't be perfect in everything. You mentioned being a mother. I have two sons which are now grown up, but you have a job to do. You have a job to do well, and you have another job to do. Which you have to do it well. And sometimes you have to let go of some things. I don't bake cookies. I've been known to look for Valentine cards at 10 o'clock at night in Walmart, but that's the kind of trade-offs we all have to make.
That sounds great. Yeah, I think one thing I would say is that people always say that you need to have a passion for what you do, and I agree with that. But I think that there's always things that you have to do within the scope of your work that you may not enjoy as much. And I think striving for excellence in all areas, the things that you love to do, plus the things that you may not like so much, is something that I've found important. So go with okay. Here's a good question. Tell us about a time that things did not go well, and what you learned from that situation.
I have a great one.
Okay. Good.
So I was the CEO of my company for 4.5 years, and 3 years in, we needed money, and we took $1 million from this guy And I knew it was a mistake, but we did it because, you need money, and you just kind of go, okay, I'm going to take the money. So he comes in, he gets on our board, and within 6 months, he and this other investor were trying to take over the company. They were trying to do a leveraged buyout and basically take down the other investors so that their stock would not be worth anything and increase their own value. And one of these guys, took me aside and was trying to convince me that I would do this, and I was smiling, and he was convinced that I was going to do this. But I played along because sometimes it's easier for me if I have a battle to play the game and then win. So that's basically what happened. I was able to put him aside and tell my investor group who was on my side what was going on. So I had, ultimately, my investor group won. I had to leave the company. I was no longer the CEO, which was fine for me. And they kicked the guy out. And they bought his stock back at less of a price. So ultimately, I won, but it was probably emotionally one of the most difficult 6 months in my life, because part of the problem as a female, I think there's something on some of your genes that emotionally gets involved sometimes, even as much as you try to keep it over here, it still is kind of eating your insides out. So it was very difficult, but everything's turned out well for me, and I just bounced back and, again, built my own business again. It just was a hard time. So.
I think for me, one of the hardest thing that not hardest, certainly, but was that when I was at Analog Devices at the end of my tenure with Analog, I was the highest ranking woman at Analog. I had very good relationship with everybody up and down the chain. I got a opportunity to work for Digital Semiconductor on a brand new product line, on a brand new market. Everything looked so great on the paper. And the day I showed up to work was the day that they announced that the Digital Semi was sold to Intel Corporation. So I ended up being involved in a very, very difficult merger between Digital Semi and Intel Corporation. And for days, certainly for months, we all went to work not knowing what are we doing, what we are going to do, is the product line going to survive, if it's not, what's going on, so to speak. So I think to me was one of the hardest professional situations I had seen myself in. Mm-hmm. It worked out well. So.
I've had a couple of experiences that have taught me that who you work for is really, really important. The company too, but the actual boss. A boss, just like a spouse that's not good chemistry, a boss that's not good chemistry can make your life miserable. So I had started at a company, I didn't mention it because I was there for only 9 months, but I started at a company before the TLO, and my boss was a jerk. I hate to say that, but he was very arrogant. He just very arrogant, thought he knew it all, and I wasn't the only person who thought so. And after about 5 months, I started looking for another job. I first tried to change it. I tried to do various things, but it was falling on deaf ears. So a couple of things I want to say. First of all, you should first try to change what you don't like. So after about 4 months, they asked me to be involved in another project. Somebody else in the company did, and I actually said, I will do so if I can change my boss. I cannot tolerate working for him. And at that point, I felt I had nothing to lose, and they did. They gave me a new boss. I'm sure my old boss hated me, but I didn't really care. So that made it tolerable for a while. I ended up leaving the company, and in fact, most of the board got fired a couple of months after I left. It was a problematic company too, but it taught me that there's a phrase in business, doing due diligence. You really need to investigate who your boss is going to be. In fact, I was naive enough that when I accepted the job, I didn't even know who my boss was. They said it would be one of two people, and they hadn't told me yet. And I would never, ever, ever do that again because it's so important. So try to meet other people who've known that person, worked with that person, see if it's a good chemistry for the way you like to work, and that will help you to avoid situations like that.
I'll add one more thing that I think at least in my experience, failing was just as important as succeeding. When I was a postdoc, a new postdoc, I just got my PhD, I embarked on a very huge experiment with just one single collaborator who was also a postdoc. And we were trying to do a new survey with a big ground-based telescope, looking for a planet that goes in front of the star, called a transit technique. Planets had not been found in that way before. So it was almost unheard of for two postdocs to do this. And we literally worked around the clock for about maybe 3 months after we got our telescope time. But the weather ended up being terrible, like rained. It's something that you can't just have eyes missing, but we needed to look at it in the summer when you can see a lot of stars because the way the galaxy is oriented. And it was in a place that doesn't rain in Chile, but it rained. And anyway, that was part of the bad luck, but it wasn't that wasn't the problem. In the end, the project failed, and it was my former thesis advisor who beat us, unfortunately, and got the first planet with this new technique. And when I look back on what failed, I was pretty unhappy because I did all the coding, a lot of the coding for this, and my colleague, she actually invented a lot of the algorithms, but then, so there was stuff I could do on the project, but then there was stuff that each of us could do that the other couldn't. And maybe this is the case of like a startup where you just have to trust. However, this other person ended up dropping the ball on something extremely critical. And just because of the way that timing goes, it's a periodic event, and if you don't have the period accurately or precisely, over time you lose information. It gets away from you, and that's ended up what happening because we didn't get everything done. I was really devastated and actually couldn't really be friends with that person. So then the question is what went wrong, and there were two things that went wrong. And after that, the biggest lesson I learned there was if you're going to work with someone else, you need to make sure they meet your standard. And that's actually, I haven't really come to terms with what that means, because especially now as I'm embarking on these larger projects, I need people who know things I don't know. And it becomes harder to trust them. The second thing was, if you're going to do a complicated experiment, this applies to the people in academia or research elsewhere, you need to get every single step correct and right with margin. And I actually had not appreciated that before because we had a single fatal flaw in our experiment that we're both to blame for, and that's why it failed. So learning those two things about choosing my collaborators carefully and then designing an experiment. I think of this now in terms of engineering. I'm looking at the two engineering students I know. When you look at the science missions that really succeed wildly, it's because every single subsystem carried margin, too much margin perhaps. So I sort of look at the experiment, even though it wasn't engineering, we had an observational program on a telescope that already existed. We didn't look at it that way, and that's why it failed.
Yeah. Great comment. Maybe I can expand a little on that.
Yeah.
So when you say due diligence, maybe you could give the audience some advice on how you would go about thinking about and investigating, choosing collaborators, sort of evaluating bosses, evaluating a work environment in a company or academia.
Well, I was lucky for my current boss. He was actually at the Harvard Tech Transfer Office. That's how I met him. And so when he ended up leaving Harvard and going to start the U.S. Office of Cancer Research Technology, and when I got an offer, or when I started interview with him, I was able to find several people and just ask, have you worked with him? What was he like to work with? But of course, people don't want to badmouth other people, so you need to ask it in such a way that you try to, get them to be honest. Taking them out for a couple of beers doesn't hurt. But yeah, so if any way you can get information, it's helpful.
I think as much as you do your due diligence, I have worked for people that I have known for a long time. And sometimes it's different. It's different to be friends with somebody than to work with that person. And, so knowing somebody doesn't always, buy you everything. But one trait that I think that I value in both my collaborators and my, whomever, my boss, my people who work for me, is the honesty. If I can find that they're honest, then I know I can deal with them. But so that's one trait that I would look for.
And I would just echo that you do not have to be friends. In fact, it's probably better not to be friends with whoever it is that you're counting on, because if you have to look them in the eye and tell them that they need to change, it's kind of like I wouldn't want to work with my husband as much as I love him. It's I just think having some distance there, having a work relationship is very different than having a business relationship from my perspective.
Yes, that's a good advice. Don't work with your spouses.
Or your best friend.
Or your best friend, yeah.
Also, in an interview, if it's comfortable, you can try to bring it up with the person who would be your hiring manager. You can say, look, if I started to work here, I would want you to feel comfortable with me and vice versa. Maybe we could talk about working styles,
Yeah,
and if
working
you have
style.
any pet peeves, like you don't want to be micromanaged, maybe there's a way you can just feel that out.
Great. Okay, so I'll move on to another question. This was requested by Sarah. Have you had an experience where you've encountered the glass ceiling or discrimination while establishing yourself? Can you tell us the story of what happened there?
Yeah, well, I'm curious to hear other stories from people about that. My story wasn't quite about that, but it was related in that, I found that once I'm like a full professor at MIT, I don't have so much of a problem with the outside world, because even if they don't know where to place you in their thinking, they're not going to give you any trouble. So I was going to give you a couple of examples where recently we started buying parts and working with a small aerospace company in Denmark. And there, I don't know much about Denmark. I thought it was very can afford for women, but there's like this bunch of 5 guys who are all like really good friends, and they work together. And one of my students visited them in the summer because we were vacationing in Switzerland, and Denmark doesn't look too far, at least on the map. So she went there, and it's not discrimination, but it's this other thing, like it's a puzzlement, like, who are you? Like, I don't really understand what category you fit in. And she went there and like super impressed them, not intentionally, but she was super impressive, and they're like, this is strange. And then one of them visited us here.
Was it strange because she was a female?
Yeah.
Oh,
she was
strange.
female.
Okay.
So then one of them visited us here on his way to another conference. And, at first he was just really, they're just not sure what to make of the group because everybody's young, and it just happens most of this group is female. And, but they're not being negative. Although one time, I wish I remembered the example, but we were having a discussion, and he was just assuming I didn't know what I was talking about, and, that kind of discrimination, where he's thinking, I'm not. And then I just nailed him on one thing, and then it was like he was done. But the thing I was trying to bring up was that it's more, I think now we're starting to see less, at least at my level and position, less discrimination, but just this general puzzlement. And we had a similar thing yesterday, actually. We had a brief visit by people from a company called NanoRacks, and just for the space enthusiasts here, what they did recently was release these little spacecraft that are like this big from the International Space Station. And it turns out it's really a funny thing. Well, they charge 80,000 a cube, but that extra money is because they do all the interfacing with you. And there's a lot of issues, because if this goes through the space station, it can come in contact with astronauts. And they're worried about toxicity levels, like if you have little, we're specifically talking about this new thruster technique that has this liquid, like the tiniest amounts. But technically, even if it's like contained, according to these people who are assessing whether it's toxic, it can get in someone's eye. There's just a lot of funny stories. Anyway, well, they deal with all that. But the same thing happened. They show up, and it's me and, Alessandra and Mary, and Paolo Lozano was there, one of his students, Fernando. But everybody's young, and even the professor who's like really, it's his thing, he looks super young. So it's like we're all here looking super, he looks really young. It's like all these students, and it's me, and, I'm a scientist, and like they have this puzzlement for like at least half an hour, an hour. So it's less of a discrimination. So I'm puzzled. I don't know if there's feedback from the audience or these other people. I don't have a problem with it. It's just awkward.
Well, I would say just the comment on Denmark, because I actually have clients in Denmark. I'll just help with this just a bit. The women in Denmark, when they have babies, take a year off or more with pay, and it's part of their system, and then they don't really go back to work. In other words, I know a venture capitalist over there that works. I mean, I'm doing her work now because she's had a baby, and basically she's taking care of this baby, but she's a venture capitalist. So I think it's the perspective that they have, that that's how women are, whereas in the United States, we women are not like that. It's very different in Europe. It's a nice system in Europe because family is much more important. But but their perspective, I think.
Right. So it's less discrimination. You just described it. It's more of a perspective.
It's more of a perspective, exactly, because they just don't see it the way we do.
Yeah, I mean, I worked as an international marketing manager. I dealt with almost everywhere in the world for analog, and a lot of times with senior management in a given big companies in a lot of them in Scandinavia, Ericsson's of the world, and Danish companies of the world. So, and it's always, you deal with a room full of men all in suit, and a lot of, all of them, and especially like, for example, in Sweden, Ericsson, all senior management, they all are related somewhat. They are all from a very small number of families. So it's you have to get used to it. I think one of the nice, I mean, when I was working in Europe and also Asia, I had my card always had my title of doctor in front of my name, which I don't use it in the United States. And somehow the fact that I was a doctor meant something to them, which, you know, created some respect and mutual understanding and respect. So.
I would say, I mean, I have been discriminated against as a female throughout my career in business because everyone who's in charge is a male. It started at Harvard. I was up for an assistant professor, and my boss, a male, came in to say, well, I just sat around with 24 men looking at your, you know, credentials, whether or not we should promote you. Ultimately, they did. Yeah. But there was this kind of like female-male thing going on there, whereas if I'd been a guy, it just never would have happened. When I was at Genzyme, there was an issue where a guy ended up, I went on maternity leave, and the guy ended up getting my business unit. I didn't complain, because if I'd complained, I would have been castigated, and you know, you just don't do that. So you know, I think the issue is you just have to just keep driving forward and not get bogged down by the fact that there are men and there are women, and there are differences in every way, and you just have to keep on your track and try not to get distracted, because it is a distraction, I think.
Any other advice on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, learn to enjoy sports. There is nothing better than talking about football with some guys and, you know, baseball.
Wow. I think, you know.
It's the male bonding. There's a question here about that, but learn to do that.
Yeah. I think for me, you know, and I think that it's good to be aware of it, but I've sort of never really focused on it or harped on it, and I've just focused on the work and focused on the goals and doing the things that I love. And, you know, that's not to say that I've been naive or, you know, not aware. I think being aware is important, but, yeah. Okay, maybe we'll take one more question, then we can open it up to the audience. This is an important question that always comes up, and I go to many events, and I hear this from women at every single event that we go to about work-family balance, time management, priorities, and how do you negotiate all the aspects of your life and balance them. So who would like to start on this one?
I don't really feel qualified to comment because I don't have kids, so
Okay.
I have a hubby, but he's pretty low maintenance.
Okay.
I have 3, and it was really hard. That's all I can say. It was really hard. At one time, we had 2 nannies, one during the day and one in the evening, and it was really expensive, but it was the only way that I could figure out how I could work all day and then go to meetings in the evening, which is what I needed to do. And no, I was not able to work the same way that one of my other best friends worked, who didn't have children. She would work all day and all night, like 24 hours. I could not do that because I had to be home sometime. So I personally think it changes your career at some level, but it doesn't stop you from achieving. It just may change some of the things you do. For example, until I left Immunetics in 1999, I'd never picked one of my children up from school, ever. And I had 3 kids who were, you know, multiple grades. So I'm just telling you, it changes what you do with your life.
But I mean, do you think there's any room for change in your industry, or do you just have to go that way?
I don't think there's any room for change. My industry is so male-dominated that, you know, when I was...
You know, what I have to wonder, too, is, so these men are never seeing their kids. Is that
These
correct?
men are never seeing their kids.
What about on weekends? Are they seeing their kids on weekends?
Well...
Because all I know is some of I used to be part of this book club with what I call normal people. And their husbands, like, you're supposed to rotate and host, like, each month. And the husbands were never home, and sometimes they'd come in at like 10 o'clock, and they'd be like, oh, he's home early. Come
That's
home at
right.
10 o'clock at night when we're just chatting.
And I would agree with that. I would
10 o'clock's
completely
early.
agree
So I'm like,
with
well, when
that.
does he see his kid? And then on the weekend, often if I would drop, the kids would go see their kids, the dad would be out of town. So I'm like, when does he ever see the kids?
That's right. No, I would agree. When I had my third child, I was at Genzyme, and I vividly remember this other guy who was about my level kind of saying, well, I guess you aren't going to travel anymore. I was traveling 60%, and I still did it because I was feeling challenged by this guy who was saying this to me, and so I just did it. But it's really hard to be in Germany when you've got 3 young children. You have to have some way to support that. But if you don't do it, you end up getting behind because your career is going to get stalled. But there's no way to do it other than to get help during those times and just try to manage it. But don't give up your kids, because I think that's really important too.
Right, so what I decided to do was burn through cash, invest in
Right.
myself so I could make more money later. So right now what I've decided to do was, spend the quality time with my kids but not do all the other stuff, like housework.
Yeah.
So I have this housekeeper, I know this is an extravagance, but I really have to just get my job done and not have my brain filled with little things. And I still have it filled with little things, but she comes for 2 hours every morning, and she makes breakfast and lunch and gets people out the door.
That's it.
But my kids know my attitude because the night before I do sometimes cook, but then I just leave like a big mess, and she doesn't mind. She'll clean it up in the morning. So then I decided that, well, my kids have to do, no, I'm not making this up. And just to validate my way of doing things, I hope it's okay if I mention this, but President Susan Hockfield, I was having a conversation with her once, and I don't know which point she did this, but someone would cook and have dinner ready, and then they would eat and then close the doors to the dining room and leave. The person in their house, I don't know who it was, would clean it up. So the point is that, because it's like you need this master plan to figure out
Whatever
the food you're going to get
takes.
and like making lunches. So the thing was, now I thought, okay, my kids need to do more work around the house. Kids, you're going to clean the table. The other one, you're going to set the table. So it comes time last night, I'm like to my kid, okay, remember what we're doing, you're going to clean the table off. So he took one fork and brought it from the table to the sink.
But
No, that's not good enough. Come on, that's not good enough. I'm like, okay, this is a problem here. But I'm just saying this because I want to do quality time with my kids. I don't want to do the other stuff. But their view of that is no one wants to do anything around the house. So I'm still sort of figuring out how to reconcile. So I thought of what to do because I didn't want to have a battle with him over something that, if I don't want to do it, can I force them to do it? And so now the next day I woke up and I'm like, okay, well, let's go over what you are willing to do here. Okay? Because if you're not willing to do that, that's fine. And so we settled on a few things he'll do, like grocery shopping. No, but seriously, it's like a constant circle. Well, we go to Whole Foods and we have dinner there and then we grocery shop, but.
that's good though.
No, I'm just saying, like, it's a constant struggle to sort of strategize. How can you, release your brain from the little things that are clogging it? Because when I'm going to sleep at night, I don't want to be thinking about what I have to make them for lunch the next day. I want to be thinking about what problem I'm trying to solve so my mind can kind of gel over it. So I don't know if there's any single solution. It's like either time or money, basically.
No, I think
I think you got to delegate as much as you can, and you got to enjoy it. I mean, if the time that you go grocery shopping, you do it with your kids, and it's a fun time, and you try to make it a fun time, and it's okay. I got help when my kids were young. They're now young men. One of them is getting a PhD at MIT. Another one is a junior at WPI. So they're now much older. But when they were young, you just try to do double duty, so to speak. If they are playing hockey, you can respond to your emails. And if you have to travel, you have to travel. I've been known to take my nanny on the road with me, which cost a fortune to me, and my employer never reimbursed me. But if I have to be away for 4 weeks, I can't be away from my kids for 4 weeks. So life is kind of trying balance. Life is difficult, but I agree. Kids are so much fun.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we can open it up to the audience, and so if you could stand and say your name, where you're from, and then I'll repeat the question so we can get it. Who will start? Or you can raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kristen. I'm from Chicago, but I think you meant I'm a grad student at MIT.
Yeah.
I'm very humble. My question is, did you ever, like for example, you mentioned working for a boss that you didn't like. Have you ever chosen a situation that you knew wasn't like in your wheelhouse, wasn't the best working find the sweet spot between like, this is just not right for me, I should move on, versus like, I should suck it up because it's good for me, and without whining, how do you cope?
Okay, I'll just
yes,
repeat
please,
it.
go
Yeah,
for it.
sorry. So the question was, did you ever take a position or job that you knew wasn't the best working environment, but you thought was a good professional development experience, and how do you balance that?
Well, since I didn't name my graduate school professor at Harvard, I can say this. I wasn't very happy in grad school, and I really was not happy with my advisor. He really didn't. He didn't really give the guidance to people that he should have, and you had to get all your guidance from postdocs. And I did have I did have a female postdoc in the lab say, well, you know, he's older, he's always kind of had issues with women. And I never knew whether to believe that, because to be honest, I mean, there were several women in the lab who did great, and so I never knew how to judge that. But that's whatever it was, I started really not being happy in about my third year, and that was the case where you really have to say, do I want to switch labs and lose time? And it's just hard, and there are no magic answers. I just bit the bullet and had a couple of miserable years, got out as fast as I could, and then tried to be more careful about looking for bosses, although I made the mistake once again before I figured out how to do a little bit better job.
I think one question is, are there other options?
Yeah, right.
You know, so if there's another option, then can you quantitatively evaluate the two options?
I took a job once in the 90s, and it was for a company that I knew, it was a publicly traded company in Canada, and I knew that my opportunity would be to start working with investment banks because it was publicly traded, so I'd be able to actually get up and actually sell their deal, blah, blah, blah. I knew it was a scumbag company, and I lasted 6 months. But I learned a huge amount, and I think, and I guess what I can say is I've done that a couple times. There's nothing wrong, number one, with failing. There's nothing wrong with leaving. So I guess on my side, sometimes I'm much more like, so you take the chance, you see what you're doing, if, you know, you may learn a whole lot, and sometimes it's the only way to get to the other side. So I guess I'm just one of those people that thinks if you think it's going to give you some valuable training, or you know, you're going to work with people that you couldn't work with otherwise, and you can deal with it, I would do it. But
I think it depends, though. Like if it's about finishing your PhD, sometimes it gets
different.
Yeah.
Right? No. That's I'm talking about a job. I'm not. Right. No, a PhD is very different stories.
And I just want to echo, you do learn a lot more from what you fail at, or things that go wrong, whether they're your fault or not, than even when you succeed, I think. So,
Yeah, I completely
never kick
agree.
yourself for failing.
Right.
Just try to figure out what you can learn from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, regret is not a very good emotion. You made a decision, something bad happened, just move on.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sonia Tiku, and I'm a grad student in planetary science at Levy. I actually have a question that's for Sara, since she's an academic still. So my question is, you talked about your postdoctoral projects that went kind of awry with working on transits, and my question is, after you have a project that doesn't work out that well, that you're seriously banking on, and also another aspect was you mentioned that your thesis advisor was someone who kind of ended up publishing what you kind of wanted to work on, and that you were doing similar things. So I guess part one is, how do you recover professionally in academia? How do you compensate for a failure like that? And the second part of that is, how do you start to differentiate yourself from your advisor in terms of your research and actually open up your new avenues? Are you ever scared of trying something different?
I'll answer both questions at once in a way by saying, and what I advise my students is that you think of it like the investment pie. Although as students, of course, you don't have any money to invest, but you know what I mean. You know, you want to do some high risk, high payoff stuff, and then you want to do some stuff that's bread and butter that you're actually going to get a publication out of. And so you have to think of it in that way. So it can't be a loss. If you're doing something super high risk, that may not work. If it fails, you can't have that be the one thing you bank on, you know? So in that sense, it was like a period of time that I did that full time, but that wasn't the only thing that I had moving forward. That's the first thing. The second thing about my PhD advisor, and this ties back to the beginning of what we were talking about how do you, what was it? what qualities do you need? I was always trying to look at you should look at leaders in your field and see what qualities they have and try to figure that out for yourself, what is required. And so somebody was always doing that. And in the end, my advisor and we worked on different things than I'd done for my thesis. But for a while, we were always doing the same different thing. And that was a bit of a problem. But in your case, it's different because it's a much more specialized topic, and that one's much more tricky. So one way to do it would be to branch out. Is there another aspect of the same problem? Maybe it's a model of, we can talk specifics another time, but it's got to be more thematic rather than the technique. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I'm
Right.
a technique person.
Right, and it's a very technique that's a very narrow technique. So in that case, it's much more difficult. But the question is asking science-driven questions then, and then finding a new technique and not being afraid. If you've succeeded at this very complicated technique, this is how I always thought for myself, I'm sure I can succeed at another very complicated technique. Yeah.
My name is Amy and I'm a grad student at MIT as well. And my question is for the male panelists. And could you provide us with an example of when empathy and kindness did help you professionally so that we can kind of set the two scenarios, the one that Sarah described and the one you're thinking of apart in our minds?
Okay, I'll just say that again. So question was, can you give an example of when empathy and kindness did help you professionally?
Sure.
Yeah.
And by the way, I should just clarify, because you're right, I am a firm believer in not getting steamrolled over. So in fact, I was on a camping trip once, people I camp with every year, and they just saw the nice side of me, and something happened, and somebody came, and I just, that's ridiculous, blah, 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 and I stood up, and the guy looked at me and said, wow, I didn't know you had that in you, and I'm thinking, you have no idea, it's just nobody had pushed me in front of you yet. So, yeah, you got to balance it. Yeah, so I'm going to answer it in a more general way. I feel that I've developed very strong relationships with the people I work with. So part of kindness to me, actually what I'm thinking of is you're at a networking event, somebody you don't know comes up and they ask you for a favor, could you give me an informational interview for 45 minutes? And they ask for your time and you give in because you want to be nice and help someone. That's more the kind of kindness I was thinking about. So I always, if I have time, I always try to help people and do things to make their lives a little easier. And what I found now that I'm in a job where my job now, when I started here, we were given a list of 40 companies, biotech, pharma companies. You need to get to know these companies. Who's the primary contact in oncology? What are they interested in? What aren't they interested in? If we have a new project, we want you to be able to send it to them. They'll answer your call, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's hard. And I started relying on my network of contacts that I had built. And I was actually very pleased that people would call me back and they would do favors for me. And so just to give an example, on Monday, my boss who's in Dublin said, Andrea, we have a problem. Our Lilly meeting canceled and we have this 3-hour time slot and, and nothing to do. And our chief scientific officer would like to meet with Regeneron and Aragon. Do you know anyone there? Well, I spent most of the day, but I actually found contacts, and both of them, by the end of the day, had me in touch with somebody at each of those companies who would talk to me. And it was kind of a pain. These people had to go out on a limb because they didn't really know if they were asking the person a big favor and I was going to waste their time. But they did it, I think, because I'd tried to help them and been kind to them in the past. And so that it's a general answer, but it's just this general, be genuine and try to help people, and because one, because it's a nice way for the world to be, but also that they're going to help you back, and you can't usually have a career on your own. You're going to need other people's help, and the more people you have to help you, it can really grease some skids here and there when you need it.
How far do you take that? Every day I receive at least, each week maybe, between 2 and 5 requests of a student who wants to come and work with me.
Right.
Whether it's for 6 months or more permanently.
Yeah.
And how can I even write back to all those? I can write back to them,
Yeah.
but how can I do everyone in the world a favor?
Right. No,
that's the being too nice part.
That's right. And you can't. You have space limitations there. So
but I'm just
right.
saying that it's impossible even to do anything. But
Yeah.
I'm not saying there isn't. I sort of feel like I need to keep my extreme view here to get my point across. I could say it's like adding someone as a co-author when they deserve to be, but you kind of rather not have them on, or so there's still ways to be generous to people in a way that can pay back or just give out that. But I find in general, it's sort of different depending on what level you're at. But,
Yeah,
you can just, basically the requests I get now are for me to help other people.
Right. And as I said, I don't have kids, so that actually opens up a window of time for me where I can afford to spend more time answering requests that honestly, if I had kids, I wouldn't also. I'd probably be saying something very different.
I don't think it's about kids or no kids. It's about wasting your own time by being too kind to others.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I would say in business, I agree with Andrea. And I have a LinkedIn account. I have 1,000 people on that account. Every single person knows me and I know them. And I can tell you how useful that can be, because when you need someone, you can get them. I mentor students. I take phone calls from individuals looking for jobs. If somehow I know them, I just make the time to do it, because I guess for me, if it were me in that position, I hope someone would help me. And people have probably helped me over the years. So I think business is different in that way, and you have to.
But it's different because you have a motivation to make the time to do those things, right?
Again,
and so it just depends on what your motivation is.
That's exactly right. I think if students were emailing me, and that would be really different. I've had people email me about jobs also, and I just write back, I can't, or, if I had a secretary, which I don't, I'd have them, politely write back.
But I think in the case of kindness, I think we're all in agreement that you just need to draw the line. It's great to be kind to people and generous and nice to everybody.
Right, absolutely.
But you've got to be conscious of where you draw the line, that's affecting your own progress forward. Absolutely. I think that's probably the best way to summarize it.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's only a certain amount of hours in the day, and you may want to think about what percentage of your time do you want to dedicate. I mean, I do tons of mentoring too. I mean, there's 6,500 graduate students at MIT.
That's right. So what do you do with that?
And so, I basically try to define a percentage of my time that I want to dedicate to some activity. And then, I want to maximize the impact during that period of time, as I dedicate it to that particular activity.
In my translation will be, I'll go back and tell my students and my children, this fraction of my time will be nice, this fraction of the time I will not be kind. I'm just kidding.
Great, go ahead.
My name's Whitney. I didn't submit the question I'm asking, so you may have trouble repeating it. But I'm a grad student at MIT, and right now I'm trying to figure out what I'd like to do after, so maybe academia or industry. And my question is, in terms of your lives, maybe now, why is what you're doing better, whether it's academia or industry? Like, can you convince basically us which one? I know it's an
Okay.
What field?
I can, yeah.
family and such. Can you explain why yours is best for you?
Okay, I'll just repeat that, yeah. So the question was really choice of academia over industry and why you've chosen that, and, yep.
I think that I made that choice when I graduated from MIT. I had quite a lot of potential academic institutions that I could go to, including MIT itself. But I woke up one morning and I decided that I don't want to teach, and I apologize if there's any freshmen here, freshman elasticity course for the rest of my life. That's not what I wanted to do. So to me, that was, that was the motivation of not staying in academia. Everything else was fantastic, but just the idea of teaching the same course every year to the same, not the same students, but the same type of students.
I just want to add something from what I've seen of people who work in your area, broadly speaking, that in academia, it's more about wanting to solve a really deep, complex problem or having some idea that seems impossible that you want to spend some time working on. Whereas the people in industry that I've met, they want to get their product done and they have the means to do so. And so they're taking the idea and implementing it and getting it completed and getting it out there. Or having an idea for something they actually want to market and sell. So I found closer to home, it's more of your own personality rather than and what you like rather than how it works for you.
What gets you up in the morning?
Yeah.
Like, I knew I was a sales.
And you might not know that, actually, until you try industry.
Because you're young. But I agree with that completely. I think someday, and I think I've decided that in your 20s, you should do almost anything, whatever you want to do, I don't care. In your 30s, you're kind of starting to develop and figure things out. And in your 40s, it's when you finally start to get it, which is, I know, a long time. But but you will know who you are. And I don't think you should make that decision now. I think you should just, I think someone said kind of just move forward. All of our resumes are great resumes, but I don't think any of us at the age of 18 could have said, our resumes would have said what they say today and how we got there.
So I'm all for like serendipity and not really trying to plan super far in advance, but I think personally, like my personality is more of like able to communicate maybe more managerial, salesy type, but at the same time, I have this big problem I'd like to stay with, but it's
Then stay with the problem.
like family though, because this also comes in. We want.
There's not a big difference between your work family life.
I don't know. I guess I have to
And
disagree.
It's the same thing.
Without getting into too many personal details, I had a major family tragedy, and my job has been so unbelievably flexible.
Oh, that's good.
And so that actually being able to take that time, when I have to, like I leave at 4:30 most days, except if I'm doing something at night with some friends, then I'll, be able to stay later. The flexibility has been just unparalleled, and I can still get my work done and move forward. And I don't think that would happen in any of your industries.
That's correct. No.
I would say if you love, you have the opportunity, which is an opportunity to do something you're doing. I don't know what it is, but I think it's fabulous. In other words, looking and discovering something is, how many people in this world get paid to do that? Like you guys do, and I look at that and I go, awesome. I love to hear about it. It's not what I want to do. But if you're doing that, why don't you do it and just really enjoy it? You can always change later. But you're being offered something now, which is the opportunity really to do some sort of great scientific investigation.
But one thing they enable you to do, I think, is to take a summer to work somewhere in industry, and that could be illuminating. Maybe you've already done it.
Could be.
Great. So we have time for about one more question. How about in the back? Over there. You look at the you.
Hi, my name is Allison Tucker, and I'm a microbiology grad student here. And one thing that kind of are talking about what career path you choose, something that I'm really interested in is actually kind of maybe taking the pressure off and volunteering for different positions for a while, so I have more visibility. And in essence, can you guys share your thoughts about being financially independent for a period and trying multiple different positions, or utilizing that time to really learn something unique about these careers, or is it really kind of that's really just not possible?
Before people jump in, I'll just tell you about a student I had this summer. He is actually a neurologist. He somehow skipped either high school or university, but for whatever reason it was, he kind of barreled through the system, he's a practicing neurologist, and he wanted to try other things. So he only worked part-time, and he approached me and said, I want to try some astrobiology. And in the end, he couldn't program really, so that was why it didn't work out. But he did this, he chose his own rotations in academia, and he randomly approached professors, and he got to do like 3 months here, 3 months there, just as you're saying. And that was so I know that was a very out there thing, because we don't see that very often, but it was really worked for him. He decided he wasn't going to do astrobiology, but he would try to now do research in his field, but in academia. And so I think he's applying to grad school now, and he'll still keep practicing at the level of 1 or 2 days a week as a neurologist, so he can keep that moving. So you can do anything.
Yeah, and it's not something people sometimes talk a lot about, is admitting that they want maybe even a lot more personal time instead of being super driven and, really, I don't know how to say this. What I'm getting at is I actually now work 4 days a week by choice. I could have took a 20% pay cut, took a day off. And I did it because I just wanted more balance in my life. And at the time, both my parents, very elderly, and they were sick, and what I was thinking is I'll spend more time with them, which I did, which was great. Okay, and now I'm at the next phase of my life, but I don't want to go back, and I'm actually right at the point of deciding what I want to do with my extra time. But right now I'm just, I have a godson I'm very close to. I'm hanging out with him and his siblings a little more, maybe helping their parents a little bit, and just doing things that end up making my husband's life a little easier because I'm taking on a little more housework type stuff. And I will do something probably more concrete in the future. But right now I'm really enjoying that balance. And it's a little embarrassing almost to admit it, because I feel a little bad that I'm working only 4 days a week, but I've chosen that, and I was lucky enough to have a job that would allow me to do that, and I think that's fine. And it's like you say, when you hit your 40s, you know who you are, and you can't deny who you are. So I would not have even thought that I would do this in my 30s, but now I'm very glad I'm doing it. And as I said, it's a little embarrassing to admit I'm doing it, but I'm glad I'm doing it, and it works for me.
Yeah, I mean, volunteering is a good way to know about different environments. I mean, within industry, it's normally called unpaid internship. But I'm sure that many industries and many companies will appreciate that. But that's a good way of working, in an environment. See if you like it. See if it's something that makes you excited about getting up in the morning and go and work there versus somewhere else. So.
Great, thank you very much. So I will turn it over.
Thanks everyone for coming out. There were some fantastic questions. Please remember to take a minute, if you haven't already, to fill out your surveys. And let's thank our panelists. We have gifts for them.